David Wyatt remembered the air that morning, thick but clean, touched with the scent of limestone and damp fruit. It was the third morning of their vacation, and they'd all woken slowly, sun spilling into the clay-colored guest house they'd rented on the edge of the Chicabul jungle. It wasn't their first time in Belize. David and Helen had been here 5 years earlier, before their daughter was born. This time, it was supposed to be about rediscovery, showing Maren a place that once meant something to them. That morning, after breakfast, Helen mentioned wanting to take Maren on a short walk down to the river, the one visible just beyond the trees behind the guest house. It was a loop trail, a mile at most, tracing the edge of the water before curving back around toward the ranger station. They'd passed it the day before. Helen had asked if it was safe, and the woman at the desk had smiled and said, "It's where we take our own kids." That had been enough. Just before noon, Helen filled 2 water bottles, packed a juice box for Maren, and zipped her phone into a pouch. Maren was already wearing her canvas shoes, the ones with cartoon frogs on the soles, and bounced as Helen applied sunscreen to her cheeks. David remembered watching them from the porch, Helen waving without saying anything, Maren flashing a toothy grin. He hadn't thought much of it, just a short walk, maybe 45 minutes. He stayed behind to clean up the kitchen and check his work email. He remembered glancing at the time, 11:57 a.m. At 1:10, he looked again. They hadn't returned. He assumed they'd stopped to skip rocks or maybe turned around early and gotten chatting with someone. He walked down the trail himself at first, half expecting to hear them laughing or spot Helen's blue tank top through the trees. But after walking the full loop, quietly calling their names, he returned to the guest house empty. He tried Helen's phone. No signal. By 3 p.m. he had circled the entire loop again, then taken the longer trail fork that passed behind the ranger station, thinking maybe they'd extended the walk. Nothing. By 4:45, he was at the front office, asking if anyone had seen them. The ranger on duty, a man named Julio Martinez, didn't seem alarmed at first. He said people sometimes wandered off trail to explore, especially with kids, but he agreed it was worth checking. By 6 p.m., 2 more rangers had joined David and Julio. They fanned out along the loop trail, shining flashlights under thick brush, calling names. A radio call was made. By 8 o'clock, it was dark. A formal missing persons report was filed. David sat on the porch of the guest house long after the lights were off, replaying their departure again and again. No backpack, no map, just the trail, just the loop. By dawn the next morning, a formal search was underway. 12 trained personnel, 3 dogs, and a drone with thermal capability. They started from the guest house and moved outward in concentric rings. The trail was well maintained, hard-packed soil with markers every 100 yards, no unusual signs, no broken branches, no disturbed soil, no footprints leaving the trail. The dogs picked up Helen and Maren's scent near the halfway mark but lost it within 20 feet. The drone found nothing, just an endless green canopy swallowing everything. Investigators interviewed everyone at the ranger station and neighboring lodges. No one had seen a woman and child after noon. A pair of tourists had passed them near the start of the trail, said the girl was holding a juice box, and the mother smiled and thanked them when they stepped aside. That was at 12:15. After that, nothing. It was as if the jungle had closed behind them. Within 48 hours, the local police had coordinated with Belize's national authorities. Posters went up, border stations were notified, and Helen's phone number was tracked. But the last ping had come just before noon, a brief GPS handshake showing her roughly a third of the way through the loop. Then, silence. By day 3, the theories began. That they got lost, turned off trail, became disoriented. But the trail had clear boundaries, marked trees, colored ribbons. Helen had hiked all over the U.S. before Maren was born. She'd once navigated the Smoky Mountains solo. And Maren, she was 6, yes, but she was cautious. David remembered her crying the day before when a lizard darted across the porch steps. She wasn't the type to charge into the woods. On day 4, local authorities quietly began considering another possibility, that they'd been taken. Rangers had found no evidence of a slip or fall, no sign of struggle, but also no sign of presence. It was the absence that became the most alarming. No dropped belongings, no disturbed dirt, no prints. It was like they had been erased. David stayed by the trailhead for hours every day. He refused to return to the States. He slept in the guest house, which had already been searched top to bottom. Every morning he walked the same trail, hoping, noticing things that weren't there, a snapped twig, a scuff mark, his mind building stories. He stopped shaving, ate once a day, waited, wondered what his daughter's voice would sound like if she were crying for help through the trees. Then came day 12, when a ranger, patrolling a waterfall trail nearly 5 miles away, spotted something out of place, a small nylon pouch wedged in the roots beside the rocks, and inside, a clue, something that changed everything, something that shouldn't have been there, and something that proved they had made it farther than anyone thought. The search that followed was immediate and intense. By the morning of June 18th, over 30 people were combing the trail system with printed maps, GPS trackers, and radios on clipped vests. At the center of it all stood David Wyatt, pale, underslept, gripping a crumpled trail brochure like it might change something. Local wildlife rangers led the initial efforts. They knew the terrain better than anyone, and many had logged hundreds of hours guiding ecotourists through the very same paths. Most of them believed Helen and Maren would be found by sundown. That first morning, they swept the entire river loop, twice, then pushed outward into side trails and offshoots. Dogs were brought in from Belmopan, German shepherds trained to track live scent. They were given Helen's tank top and Maren's stuffed frog, which still sat on the guest house bed. The dogs pulled hard at first, barking near the halfway mark of the trail, the same stretch where the GPS ping had dropped. But 20 yards later, they stopped, circled, whined. One handler radioed in. They're confused, like the scent just ends. Helicopters were grounded due to weather, but a pair of drones equipped with infrared were launched at first light on day 2. They scanned the entire river basin and northern ridge. Thermal signatures returned false hits, usually deer, occasionally monkeys. One alert near a stream turned out to be a pair of sleeping feral dogs. From above, the jungle looked endless. The canopy blocked nearly everything. The volunteers came next, tourists, villagers, even workers from nearby citrus farms. They moved in staggered grids, calling names, beating underbrush with walking sticks, following flag markers left by the rangers. A few locals said they remembered a mother and child passing through. One woman swore she'd heard a child crying on the wind 2 nights earlier, but couldn't say from where or what time. Others believed it was parrots mimicking human voices. The jungle played tricks, they said, especially at night. By the end of day 3, the optimism began to fray, not because of what had been found, but because of what hadn't. No clothing, no footprints, no broken twigs or disturbed dirt, no signs of a slide, no blood, no scraps of trash. There were no indicators of panic, no direction of movement, not even the juice box Maren had been holding. Nothing. David kept repeating the same line to anyone who would listen. Helen would not have gone off trail. She wasn't impulsive. She wouldn't take risks, especially with Maren. She was cautious, the kind of person who double-checked every reservation, who always carried backup water and a whistle when hiking. And Maren, she was terrified of bugs. She'd had a meltdown over a tree frog on their first day. There was no version of reality where she would willingly wander into the underbrush. Authorities began keeping David updated in a formal capacity by day 4, daily briefings, assigned liaison. The mood behind the scenes was shifting, whispers of disorientation, that maybe Helen had suffered heat stroke or a sudden panic, that maybe Maren had gotten scared and run. But there were no signs to support any of it. The temperature had been mild. Helen's health was good. She knew the terrain, and there had been no recent storms to obscure tracks. That's when a different theory surfaced: animal attack. Belize was home to jaguars, yes, but attacks on humans were extremely rare and usually left clear signs. A struggle, drag marks, blood. Rangers explained this to the officials, but still the idea made its way into the first press conference. It was a theory that sounded tragic, but final. People could live with it. David couldn't. He refused to accept any version that didn't include a decision. Helen wouldn't just vanish, and Maren wouldn't follow unless told. Someone, he insisted, had made them disappear. Whether they walked or were taken, it hadn't been random. By day 7, media outlets began to trickle in. Small regional channels, then international correspondents. Most ran quiet human interest segments, showing footage of volunteers searching through thickets of green, with David's voice layered over it. They're out there. I know they are. Someone has them. He wore the same clothes for days, eyes ringed in gray. He barely spoke unless asked a direct question. He didn't cry on camera. The guest house was cleared out for forensic review, even though no signs pointed there. David's laptop, Helen's phone backups, their travel itinerary, all were pulled and logged. The police found nothing suspicious. No money withdrawn, no altered travel plans, no hidden messages. They weren't running. They had every reason to come back. The Rangers didn't stop. Not completely, but the volunteer numbers dropped after the second week. Media moved on to a new storm front in the Gulf. The briefings became shorter. And then one day, they stopped altogether. Officials issued a formal statement labeling the case as missing, presumed lost. The narrative leaned back to nature. Thick jungle, dangerous terrain, sudden disorientation. A tragic, explainable loss. David stopped answering calls from extended family. He slept in the back of his rented Jeep, parked near the trailhead. Locals offered him food. He barely touched it. Instead, he walked, sometimes through the night, tracing the same loop trail again and again. As if repetition could change the outcome. As if eventually the path would break open and give them back. But the jungle never spoke. It just took. And somewhere in the quiet, David began to wonder if the silence was hiding something worse than loss. Because trails don't erase people. Someone does. 12 days after Helen and Maren disappeared, the official search was beginning to quiet. Not stopped, not entirely, but thinned. Volunteers had mostly returned home. Authorities were scaling back drone flights, citing weather and cost. Even David could feel the shift. People were saying all the right things, but their eyes were different now, less urgent, less hopeful. He'd started walking farther from the trailhead, into regions not marked on the guest maps, following nothing but instinct. But on the morning of the 12th day, it wasn't David who found the first real clue. It was Julio Martinez, the same ranger who had launched the initial search with David. He'd stayed involved longer than most, mostly out of guilt. That day, he was hiking a narrow ridge near the old copper runoff, a place few tourists ever visited, about 5 miles west of the river loop. There, tucked between the roots of a thick-barked ceiba tree, right where the incline dropped off toward the canyon waterfall, he spotted something blue, faded, wedged in the mud. It was a child's nylon pouch, the kind with mesh siding and a tiny carabiner loop. Julio picked it up and felt a cold weight in his stomach. Inside was a single child's sock, pink with frogs, soaked and hardened, a cracked pair of adult sunglasses with one lens missing, and at the bottom, a juice box half full, bloated from the heat. The straw was still sealed. The expiration date matched a Belize City brand stocked in local corner shops. The pouch was zipped shut. Julio didn't touch anything else. He photographed the pouch, the location, and the slope of the terrain before alerting the lead coordinator. By the time the team arrived, word had already reached David. He arrived 2 hours later, sunburnt, out of breath, holding Maren's other sock, the matching pair. He said Helen had packed that pouch the morning they left. He recognized the juice box flavor, and the glasses had been his, loaned to Helen when hers cracked on the plane. But what disturbed him most wasn't what was inside. It was where it was found. The waterfall sector was remote, buried behind old mining roads and animal paths barely visible without experience. There were no main trails leading there, no guided tours. To reach it, you had to hike through sloped terrain, thick with bramble and loose rock. Rangers agreed. There was no way Helen would have led Maren that far. Not without gear, not without telling someone, and certainly not in sandals. Teams swept the area immediately. They sent up drones again, scanned tree lines, dug through the wet loam for any indication of passage. But there were no footprints, no threads of clothing caught in branches, no broken sticks. The soil showed no compression except from the search crew. The bag looked placed, not dropped, and it wasn't waterlogged, suggesting it hadn't been there long, maybe not even a full day. The working theory split two ways. One camp believed it had been carried there by runoff, washed downstream from a higher ridge, but that would have soaked the bag, ripped the seams, and damaged the juice box seal. None of that had happened. The other theory, whispered but not officially stated, was that someone had placed it there deliberately, recently, as if someone wanted them to find it, but not too soon. The discovery reignited media interest. Helicopter crews returned. So did pressure from both Belizean and American authorities. The U.S. Embassy sent representatives to monitor progress, and search efforts refocused entirely on the waterfall sector. For 4 straight days, trained rescue teams combed the perimeter in spirals, rappelled into canyons, and even sent divers into narrow plunge pools. But again, nothing. Not even a trace. David, meanwhile, became fixated on the idea that Helen or Maren had left the bag as a marker, a signal, a breadcrumb. He started mapping distances, calculating time. If they'd been forced to move, maybe they'd been led there, or passed through it. Maybe it was the edge of something, or the center. That's when local whispers began to resurface. Old stories about the echo paths. The Chickabull Forest had its legends. Rangers spoke of areas where sound traveled wrong, places where your own footsteps sounded like they belonged to someone behind you, where animal calls echoed for miles, and sometimes people swore they heard voices that didn't belong to anyone. Folklore, mostly. But the name came up more than once. Echo paths. Regions where travelers, usually outsiders, would feel pulled toward sounds that weren't real. One guide claimed to have followed a crying voice for 3 hours once, only to find an empty ravine. Another said you could stand in one spot and hear your own voice thrown back at you from 3 different directions. David listened, didn't speak. But that night, he started bringing a portable speaker with him on hikes, one that played Maren's voice from old birthday videos, just in case. The bag was logged as evidence, sent to a forensic lab in Belize City. Results confirmed fingerprints on the juice box belonged to Maren. But there were no foreign prints, no blood, no hair, just proof they'd been alive long enough to reach, or be brought to, that waterfall. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had they gotten there? Why leave only the bag? And if someone had helped or hurt them, why had they made sure this small, strange clue was all that remained? The trail was no longer the center. The map had widened, but the jungle still wasn't giving anything up, except for the sense that something was watching. After the bag was found, something in David shifted. Until then, he'd been surviving in a fog, moving, reacting, sleeping only when exhaustion forced it. But holding that juice box in his hand changed the shape of the silence. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was proximity. They had been alive, recently, close. Someone had seen them. Someone had touched that bag, and whoever that was had let it be found. David began obsessing over how to bridge that gap, how to force the next clue into the open. He didn't believe the jungle swallowed things whole. He believed someone was navigating it, and whoever it was, they were watching, choosing when to reveal pieces. He needed to make noise, draw them out, or her, or both. He remembered something Helen had told him once, years earlier, when Maren was just a toddler, that if a child heard a parent's voice in the distance, even in a crowd, they would instinctively move toward it. She said it was biological, primitive, a survival response buried deep in the brain. That idea stuck with him, and now it felt like a thread he could pull. So David started recording her voice. He scoured old family videos for clean clips, birthday parties, bedtime routines, anything where Maren said words clearly. Then he extracted the audio, trimmed it, and loaded it onto a portable Bluetooth speaker. A simple one, battery-powered, clipped to his vest. He tested it first by walking the main trail and playing a clip on loop. Maren laughing, Maren saying, "Hi, Daddy," Maren counting to 5. Each time, the sound echoed into the trees in a way that didn't feel quite right. like it bounced and lingered even when the speaker had stopped. Over the next few days, he hiked farther and farther off trail into denser sectors the rangers had already cleared but never fully explored. He played the recordings at intervals, letting them run, pausing, then calling out himself. He told no one at first, just kept going, playing his daughter's voice into the void, hoping it might ripple out and touch something that would ripple back. On the 5th day, he brought a local guide, a man named Ronaldo who'd worked rescue operations in the jungle for years. They headed northwest toward an area near the limestone outcrops, high ridges that overlooked 2 ravines and a dried-up creek bed. David played the recording every 300 feet, and for hours, nothing. Then, just after 3 in the afternoon, Ronaldo stopped walking. David saw it in his face first, something brittle, focused. Ronaldo held up a hand and said he'd heard something, faint, far, from the opposite ridge, a sound, maybe a cry, maybe a child. They stood still for minutes. The jungle was never fully quiet, always rustling, always calling. But this sound had been sharp, human. It hadn't repeated. David began recording with his phone, pointing it in the direction Ronaldo indicated. Then he played Marin's voice again, softly this time. "Hi, Daddy," followed by a laugh, then silence. Another sound came, but this one was less distinct. A rustle, a shift, maybe an echo, maybe nothing. But Ronaldo swore he heard it again, a child, not words this time, just tone, fear. They stayed on that ridge for 2 hours. Then darkness began to fall, and the ranger escort called them back. It was too steep to descend safely after sundown. David returned to the ranger station and immediately uploaded the audio from his phone to his laptop. He used basic sound software to isolate frequencies, trying to separate jungle noise from possible speech. It was messy. Wind, birds, insects, layers of sound piled on top of one another. But there was something, a high, quick pitch buried deep in the waveform, a yelp or a syllable. He brought it to the forensic team, who passed it along to Belize's National Digital Crime Unit. Spectral analysis confirmed a spike, sudden, brief, human-range frequency, but not enough to determine origin. One technician said it could be a bird. Another said it might be a child. No one could say for sure. Then Julio, the same ranger who'd found the pouch, listened closely with headphones. He didn't analyze it. He just listened. After 30 seconds, he took the headphones off slowly and said, "I heard her say Daddy." Others disagreed. They called it pareidolia, the tendency to hear meaning where there is none. Like hearing a voice in white noise, projection, desperation. They didn't say it outright, but the implication hung there. David wanted it too badly to be objective, but David didn't care. He played the recording again and again, in headphones, out loud, slowed down, reversed. To him, it was clear. A single word, not even fully formed, just the rawest version of it. Daddy, like a flare from the dark. From that point on, David stopped asking for permission. He extended his stay indefinitely, sold the remainder of their return tickets, rented a satellite phone, changed currencies, told his job not to expect him back. He stopped going to media briefings and started building his own grid of the jungle on a wall in the ranger's supply cabin. Pins, strings, sound maps, elevation changes, every ridge and ravine, every place an echo might bend. If she had called once, she could call again. And if no one else believed it, he would still be there, listening. Because he no longer thought she was gone. He thought she was waiting to be heard. By the 4th week, David had stopped thinking in days and started counting in distances, how far sound could carry, how far a child could walk in bare feet, how far someone might drag a mother and daughter without being seen. He'd redrawn the ranger trail maps 3 times by then, overlaying them with his own routes, annotated with potential echo points, heat anomalies, places where animals behaved strangely. He knew the patterns better than most of the rangers by then. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't shake, was the sense that someone else knew this jungle better than all of them. It was on the 27th day that the man came. Not to police, not to the rangers, not to officials, but to David directly. It was early morning. David was sitting outside the ranger station with a lukewarm cup of instant coffee when he saw him. A lean older man with deep lines in his face and boots caked in reddish clay. His name was Elias, a fisherman who ran a canoe rental on the western edge of the jungle, near the slower waters of the Mopan River. He looked nervous, said he'd heard about the search, said he had something David needed to see. From his satchel, Elias pulled out a folded, weather-worn scrap of brown paper. It wasn't official, not a park map, not a ranger overlay. It was drawn by hand in charcoal pencil, the lines smudged and damp from handling. He unfolded it carefully on the bench between them. It showed a narrow ravine system that didn't appear on any public trail charts. Near the bottom of the page, he'd written one word in English: "Saw them." Elias explained. 2 weeks earlier, around day 13 of the search, he had been checking fish traps along a shallow creek bed that ran through a jagged ravine about 15 miles from the original disappearance site. The area was remote, not impossible to reach, but difficult without local knowledge. Around midday, he'd seen movement upstream, 3 figures. A man walking several paces ahead, upright, calculated. Behind him, a woman and a child, barefoot, moving quietly. The woman looked pale, and the child kept holding her arm like it was injured. Elias said the man had a military posture, not just straight-backed, controlled, scanning side to side with every few steps, not rushed, not frantic, purposeful. He thought at first it was a training exercise, maybe part of the anti-poaching unit. He didn't call out, didn't want to interfere. He waited for them to pass, then turned back down the creek. He hadn't spoken to anyone about it until now. He hadn't known anyone was missing until the flyer came through the village last week. That's when he recognized the faces. David stared at the map. It made no sense. The ravine system was too far, too off-grid. They would have needed transport to get there, or days on foot. But Helen didn't have gear, no food, no shoes. If Elias was telling the truth, it meant she and Maren had survived at least 13 days. And they hadn't been alone. Authorities were skeptical. They reviewed the map but pointed out that there were no photos, no timestamp, no physical evidence, and Elias couldn't recall the exact day. Memory, they said, was unreliable, especially under heat and fatigue. They agreed to send a small team to sweep the area, more out of obligation than belief. David wasn't invited, but he followed anyway. He met the search party at the edge of the old logging trail and insisted on joining. The terrain was brutal. Jagged shale, low branches, and narrow footpaths grown over with vines. It took nearly 4 hours just to reach the outer edge of the ravine. They found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed foliage, no signs of shelter or movement. One ranger suggested a mudslide weeks ago could have erased any trace of passage. Another said the area was too remote to be meaningful, a dead lead. They marked the map and logged the sweep, then headed back before dark. David lingered, standing alone in the dry creek bed, staring upstream. He tried to imagine Helen there, her arms around Maren, eyes scanning the ridge. Wondered what it would take to stay silent if someone dangerous told you not to scream. He wondered what kind of man could keep a woman and child quiet in the wild. 2 days later, when authorities tried to follow up with Elias, he didn't answer. His small river shack, which had doubled as his rental post, was found unlocked and abandoned. Inside, dishes still on the table, a lantern burned down to the nub. His fishing canoe was tied to the post, but his personal gear, boots, knife, map satchel, was gone. No one in the village had seen him leave. No one knew where he'd gone. His map remained in David's pocket, now laminated and worn from folding. The lead had dried up again, like the creek. But to David, it was the closest thing to confirmation yet. Helen and Maren hadn't vanished. They'd been taken, moved, hidden, and whoever was doing it knew the jungle too well to be caught by search teams or traced by scent. They weren't chasing shadows anymore. They were chasing someone who knew how to erase them. By the 6th week, the jungle had quieted again, not in sound, but in momentum. The press cycle had moved on. The rangers returned to their routines. And even some of the officials began using past tense when referring to Helen and Maren. The map on the operations board hadn't been updated in days, but David hadn't slowed. If anything, he moved more deliberately now, pushing past sanctioned boundaries, less concerned with protocol than with possibility. He wasn't waiting for permission anymore. It was a heat-glared afternoon when the first new anomaly came in. A drone operator running a routine flyover noticed something strange. Thin gray smoke trailing through the treetops, dissolving quickly, but just visible enough against the sunlight. The coordinates placed it deep in a restricted section of the forest, an area marked as a no-go zone due to cartel movement and suspected smuggling routes. The drone team flagged it but hesitated to investigate directly. Instead, they forwarded the feed to the embassy liaison. Within hours, the footage reached military intelligence. That night, a covert unit was mobilized, Belizean special forces with jungle warfare training. They moved in fast, quietly, with minimal footprint. David didn't find out until the next day, when the liaison briefed the remaining search coordinators. The team had found the location of the smoke, a narrow clearing partially hidden under dense canopy. At the center, the remains of a makeshift camp, still warm, ashes from a recent fire, crushed food tins, local brands, some opened, some blackened, a plastic jug of river water, and scattered debris, banana peels, broken twigs, and cloth fibers clinging to the bark of a leaning tree. But no people. What they did find, tucked in the roots of a collapsed tree beside the camp, was a small discarded toothbrush, faded purple, with a chipped cartoon dolphin at the end of the handle. It was sent immediately to Belize City for forensic testing. Results came back within 2 days. Traces of dental biofilm matched Marin's dental records, which had been provided by her pediatric dentist back in New Hampshire. The brush had been used, recently, within the last 10 to 14 days. The response shifted immediately. What had once been an unofficial missing persons search was now classified as a suspected abduction. A liaison from the FBI's International Operations Unit was dispatched from the U.S. Embassy. A new perimeter was drawn, and satellite surveillance requests were submitted. But the window had already closed. Whoever had stayed at that camp was long gone. David wasn't satisfied. He asked to see the camp. He asked again and again. The answer was no, too dangerous, too remote, beyond the protection of official resources. But David had stopped asking for permission weeks ago. 2 days after the site was cleared, he left at sunrise with Ronaldo, the same guide who'd heard the voice weeks earlier, and began heading west. They carried satellite GPS, water purification tabs, and audio recordings loaded on a fresh speaker. David wore the same cargo vest he'd worn every day for a month. He barely spoke during the first half of the hike. They reached the coordinates by late afternoon. The clearing was still marked with char and disturbed soil. The fire pit had been kicked over but was still blackened at the edges. Tin shards glinted under the brush. David moved slowly, scanning the perimeter, crouching to examine the ground. Near the far edge of the camp, wedged between 2 stones, he found a length of string, the kind used to wrap tarp corners. On it was a single strand of long brown hair, kinked at the end. It was pocketed, logged, but again, no people, no trail, no footprints leading out. What unnerved David most was what was missing. There was no fabric from shelter, no bags, no shoes, not even animal remains. Everything had been stripped down to the basics. It was like someone had lived just enough to stay alive, and then moved on. Not rushed, but calculated. Like they knew how long they could afford to stay. When David returned to the ranger station, he asked to see updated drone footage. The operator replayed the earlier capture, smoke rising in a steady stream. But David noticed something. The fire hadn't been burning high. No movement near the source. The drone had circled twice. That meant whoever had made the fire knew they were being watched, and stayed perfectly still. Or they had already gone, minutes before. To David, there was only one explanation. Helen and Marn were alive, and being kept mobile, shifted from site to site, never long enough to leave a trail. The pattern was too clean, too practiced. Someone was moving them with the discipline of a unit, not a wanderer, not a panicked drifter. This was calculated. The FBI liaison began building a working profile, ex-military, knowledge of jungle terrain, familiarity with surveillance windows, possibly using hollowed trails that had long since been overgrown. Cartel involvement was considered, then dismissed. There were no signs of trafficking, no ransom demands, no digital fingerprints. Whoever this was didn't want money. They wanted to remain invisible, and they were good at it. David started carrying a compass even on marked routes, began drawing his own directional notes in a field book, analyzing not just movement, but behavior. Where someone would stop to resupply, where water was safest to drink, where smoke could rise without being seen. He wasn't just searching anymore. He was tracking. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the question turned from are they alive to what are they being prepared for? Because camps like that weren't built for comfort. They were built for control. By week 9, David's eyes had hollowed into something quiet and fixed. He no longer asked how long they'd been gone. He asked only how far they could have been moved and how precisely someone would need to operate to keep 2 people hidden for so long. Every meal was a ration, every hour logged in his field notebook. He slept in 1-hour bursts now, waking to jungle sounds he no longer reacted to. Most people assumed he was on the edge of collapse, but David had passed that edge 3 weeks ago. Now he was simply tuned to something else. The smallest shifts in the trees, the slight bend of a branch where none should be, the timing of the birds going quiet. That morning, a few minutes after 5 a.m., he was alone on a ridge just outside the basin sector, marking echo points with Ronaldo's compass. The air was cooler up there, still damp from an overnight storm. The canopy gave way slightly on the ridgeline, enough for a few weak beams of light to fall through. David had just replayed one of Marin's voice clips, a soft loop of her calling, "I'm here, Daddy," followed by her laugh, captured years ago while she played hide-and-seek in their old backyard. He'd played it 100 times before. But this time, what followed wasn't playback. It came from somewhere down in the trees, sharp, sudden, and human. A scream, high-pitched, fractured by distance but unmistakable. A child's voice. Then a second one, older, lower. A woman's scream, laced with panic, cut short like the breath had been stolen right from it. For a full 2 seconds, David froze. Not because he didn't believe it, but because his body couldn't catch up. Then instinct took over. He ran. Downhill. Through branches, thorns, loose stone. The speaker clipped to his vest, still playing faint static. He hit record on his GPS-tagged audio recorder mid-sprint. The jungle blurred around him. The screams didn't repeat, but he thought he heard something else. Crashing leaves, a movement not his own. Then silence again. Complete, heavy, almost staged, as if the jungle had swallowed everything right after giving just enough. He stopped near the basin floor, panting, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, no voices, no footprints, just the tremble of ferns he might have brushed on the way down. But the recording had captured it. He was sure of it. He flagged the coordinates, marked a tree with a strip of red cloth, and hiked back up to signal Ronaldo, who had waited at the secondary camp. By late morning, a team had assembled, 3 rangers, 2 embassy observers, and David. The audio file was pulled from the recorder and played back through high-fidelity headphones. The spike in volume was visible in the waveform, 2 distinct frequencies, consistent with a child and an adult female. Experts couldn't isolate the words, but they agreed. The vocal signature was real. No animal, no mechanical interference, human and recent. For the first time in over a month, the search perimeter shifted. The basin sector, previously deemed too rugged for standard search protocol, became the new focus. The team entered cautiously, machetes in hand, carving through dense palm thatch and vine-netted corridors. The humidity pressed like water. David walked second in line behind Julio, gripping the printed waveform in one hand and his own breath in the other. Halfway through the approach, one of the rangers spotted something unusual, a patch of disturbed ground, rounded in a way that didn't match any animal den. When the brush was cleared, they found a layer of woven palm fronds, dry and brittle. Beneath that, hardened clay, smooth in the center, uneven at the edges, cracked by heat. Then someone's boot hit something hollow. They cleared with blades and gloved hands. What emerged beneath the foliage was a rust-stained hinge and part of a recessed handle, old but intact. A trapdoor, heavy, buried in layers of soil and camouflage, possibly hidden for years. The lid wouldn't lift without leverage. Tools were called in. When it finally creaked open, the smell that escaped was metallic and damp, stale air soaked in earth. A ladder descended into shadow. They lowered a camera down first, mounted to a cable pole. At the bottom, a dirt floor, a pair of metal hooks embedded in the rear wall, and what looked like the remains of makeshift bedding, rotted tarp, shredded cloth, animal bones. On the far side, a shallow alcove had been dug into the wall, almost like a shelf, containing an empty plastic jug and the dried husk of a fruit rind. It wasn't a shelter. It was a cage, a place someone had built not for survival, but containment. No one was inside. But on the near wall, scratched into the clay in uneven lines, were markings, tally strokes, dozens of them, counted days or hours, and in the top right corner, written with what might have been a fingertip or a dull blade, the letter M. No other initials, no words, just that, and the unmistakable proof that someone had been there, kept there, long, enough to mark time. The team went silent. No one speculated out loud. But David already knew. He could feel it in his chest. This wasn't the first place they'd been held. Just one of many. A stopover, a controlled point. The trapdoor was covered again, forensics called in, coordinates sealed. But the screams had done what weeks of search hadn't. They had cracked open the jungle. Just enough. Now, finally, they had somewhere real to follow. And for the first time, David began to believe the silence had an edge. And they were closing in on it. The trapdoor was just the beginning. Once the perimeter was secured, a joint team of forensic investigators and structural analysts arrived at the ridge basin. Over the next 48 hours, the soil was carefully removed layer by layer. What began as a single pit widened into something else, a concealed entryway into a subterranean cavity, partially reinforced with scavenged materials, cement slabs, rusted corrugated sheet metal, and lengths of rebar twisted together into crude latticework. The room, when fully exposed, measured no more than 10 by 12 feet. Low ceiling, packed dirt floor. But everything inside told the same story. Someone had been kept there. And for a long time. The cell was built with intention. Steel bars were driven deep into concrete blocks, forming a partial cage across one corner of the chamber. There was no door. Instead, a section of the bars had been fastened shut with copper wire and bent nails, as if meant to be cut and rewired from the outside. The interior was bare. No mattress, no clothing, just pieces, fragments of the people who had passed through it. Against the far wall, investigators found a clump of human hair, tangled in one of the steel joints. It was long, dark brown, and still held bits of scalp tissue. A strip of fabric, faded green, was pinned beneath a stone near the corner, torn and hardened. Nearby, the imprint of a small hand was faintly visible in the dirt, and scratched into the clay wall with what looked like a rock or piece of bone were drawings, childlike, erratic, spaced unevenly. Stick figures, one large, one small. A square with lines inside it, maybe meant to be a window, and beneath it all, a series of descending lines carved into the wood of a flattened crate, tally marks. Each group bundled in fives, 53 in total, 53 days or nights, or some mixture of both. They had kept track. Samples were collected, swabs, soil, hair, fabric. The forensic lab in Belize City returned the results within 72 hours. The hair and fabric both carried biological markers consistent with Helen Wyatt. On the corner of the rebar frame, dried blood was found, old, oxidized, but still viable for testing. The DNA profile came back as a partial match to Moran, consistent with an injury, possibly a nosebleed or cut lip. There was no evidence of recent habitation. Whoever had held them there had cleared out long before. The trapdoor was discovered, but it wasn't the interior that revealed the most. It was the trees. About 20 yards from the cage, facing a narrow animal trail, a ranger spotted a small cluster of plastic tucked high in the canopy. On closer inspection, it was a motion-activated trail camera, the kind used by hunters. But this one had been modified, no company label, Power supply upgraded, a SIM card buried in the battery slot, sealed with adhesive. When they widened the search, they found two more, one aimed directly at the trapdoor, the other positioned for wide coverage of the approach trail. The implications were immediate and chilling. Whoever built this cell hadn't just hidden it. They'd watched it. They'd monitored movement, maybe remotely, maybe nearby. But someone had eyes on the cage, and anyone who got close to it, not just to observe, but to be warned, to disappear if needed. The FBI liaison ordered the feed decrypted and the cameras analyzed. Only one was still functional. Its battery had died within the last week. The last few images were corrupted, pixelated, grainy, partially overwritten. But the timestamps confirmed one thing. Someone had been there within the past 14 days. A shadow moved through the clearing on frame 2294. A lean figure, blurred at the edges, head turned away. No visible face, just a backpack and what looked like the butt of a machete strapped to the left hip. Military posture, just like the fisherman had described. But there was more. On frame 2292, 2 frames earlier, a shape crouched near the trapdoor. Smaller, child-sized, hair matted, face tilted up, no clear features, but the arms were raised, reaching toward the canopy, toward the camera, toward the sky. Then, nothing. The feed stopped. Whoever returned had taken the others. Battery packs were yanked, SIM cards gone. Even the branches around the mounts had been cut away. The area had been sterilized, and yet they had left the cage behind. Not by mistake, by design. Because they knew the team would find it eventually, knew they were being followed now, and still, they'd stayed ahead. David stood in the cell that afternoon, hands at his sides. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He stared at the tally marks in the stick figure with the window. He counted the marks twice. This had been one stop, not the first, probably not the last, a waypoint in a pattern he couldn't fully see yet. But he knew the pattern was real. And somewhere, just beyond reach, they were still in motion, being kept, being watched, but not lost, not yet. The surveillance equipment recovered near the subterranean cell, specifically the modified trail cameras, became the next focus of the investigation. While their SIM cards had been stripped, their wiring told a story. The power supply was custom spliced, and the circuit boards bore markings consistent with a batch of thermal-compatible units used during training operations in Central America a decade earlier. Most civilians would never have accessed those parts. They weren't commercially available, but a few units had been decommissioned and sold through military surplus auctions. That list was short. Cross-referencing purchase orders and serial numbers led to a single name, Russell Hayes. Former private contractor, ex-Special Forces, records showed he had been deployed in multiple jungle warfare theaters between 2006 and 2015. After his final tour, he transitioned to independent training programs, operating under various subcontractors, mostly in counterinsurgency, remote tracking, and terrain-based psychological conditioning. Then, in 2019, he vanished. No tax records, no housing utilities, no license renewals, just gone. Until now. The FBI liaison, working in cooperation with Belizean intelligence, authorized an aerial sweep west of the basin sector, toward the Guatemalan border, where a narrow trail of freshly broken canopy had been spotted during a routine patrol flight. Infrared showed signs of intermittent movement along a faint gear line, disturbed leaves, tarp impressions, and heat signatures that faded too quickly to be animal. Something, or someone, was still shifting camps. 5 days into the search, a drone pilot flying just after dawn noticed an anomaly in the clearing near a salt basin, a patch of bright red against the jungle floor. Not fabric. Blood. A team was dispatched within the hour. There, crumpled at the edge of the clearing, half buried in his own pack, lay Russell Hayes. Shot once, low in the abdomen, pale, barely conscious. His hands were covered in dried mud and insect bites, his breathing ragged. The ranger who first approached said he looked less like a soldier and more like a cornered animal. He didn't resist. Medics stabilized him enough to transport to a secure medical tent near the ranger base. As fluids took hold and pressure dressings slowed the bleeding, Hayes became lucid enough to speak. Not formally, not through an interview, but in fractured, half-delirious statements recorded on an agent's phone. What he said didn't come as a full confession, not in legal terms, but it offered something more valuable: insight. He admitted he had been in the jungle since early May, alone at first, then training others. When asked what kind of training, he said it plainly: psychological containment. How to hold someone without tying them, how to break orientation, make people doubt what they hear, build places they can't trust. He spoke of echo paths, of using sound to trap movement, of watching from high canopy stations where no one looks. He never mentioned who the trainees were, only that they came and went, and most couldn't handle the isolation. "But I could," he whispered. "I stayed." When shown photos of Helen and Marn, Hayes closed his eyes for a long time, then nodded. He said they weren't supposed to be there. They walked into something meant for someone else, but once they were there, we adapted. He never clarified who "we" was, just said they were kept. When asked where they were now, he hesitated, said they had escaped, said Helen had figured out how one of the perimeter traps worked, had flipped the trigger plate without alerting the motion sensor. It was a test, he said, but she didn't wait for the rest. She ran, and she took the child. They disappeared, he said, voice hoarse, into the terrain. Like they were made for it. They stopped being people, started being part of the trees. The phrasing struck everyone as bizarre, evasive, but it was consistent with a psychological tactic Hayes had once written about in a declassified training manual, using deprivation and manipulation to sever a captive's sense of linear time. Turn them from person to element, make them think like landscape, hide like fear. He said he tried to follow them, set new paths, laid low-frequency speakers, but they changed routes, slipped between sectors. They started leaving signs meant only for David. She knew he was listening, Hayes mumbled. She knew the sound would carry. He spoke of a map burned into memory, not paper, but walked into the ground, of paths that only repeat if you're being led. Then he said something quieter. She became what we tried to be. That night, Hayes went into cardiac arrest. The bullet had torn through his lower intestine and ruptured vessels feeding into the liver. He died before sunrise, never regaining consciousness. In the days that followed, agents searched the clearing where he was found. They located a small notebook buried beneath a stone, mostly unreadable, its pages destroyed by rain. But one entry was still legible. A date. 1 week earlier, followed by 2 words. She moved. To David, it meant only one thing. Helen hadn't just escaped. She was navigating, not randomly, not desperately, strategically, toward something, maybe toward him. 4 days after Russell Hayes bled out on a stretcher beneath a canvas tarp, the search team at the ranger base received a radio call from a road maintenance crew working north of San Ignacio, near the edge of a long-abandoned plantation. The foreman didn't sound panicked, just confused. A woman and a child had walked out of the trees, barefoot, caked in dirt, skin sunburnt and shredded with scratches. They didn't speak at first. The woman held the child close, shielding her eyes from the sun like it was something foreign. She had no bag, no phone, just a folded rag of cloth tied around her wrist with 3 tally marks scratched into it. It was Helen and Marin. Medics were on site within 30 minutes. By then, both had collapsed. Helen was conscious, barely. Marin was dehydrated and feverish, but clinging to her mother's side with a grip that wouldn't break. The crew gave them water, shade, silence. When asked who they were, Helen rasped 2 words. He's close. They were airlifted from the nearest clearing and taken to a secure field clinic under embassy supervision. For hours, officials tried to debrief Helen, but she refused to speak until David arrived. When he did, sun-worn, gaunt, shaking, she stood on her own and walked to him like her body had never been broken. No screaming, no crying. Just a single breath pressed into his shirt and the sound of Marin whispering, "I knew you heard me." Their vitals told the rest of the story. Malnourishment, muscle loss, minor injuries, insect bites, minor lacerations, mild trench foot, but no broken bones, no signs of sexual assault, no burns, no poison. They hadn't been tortured, not in the way most people think. What had been done to them had been slow, atmospheric, psychological. Days later, in her first formal debrief, Helen described what she remembered. She said they were moved between sites, always at night, always silent, sometimes by foot, sometimes blindfolded. The first days had been spent underground, in the cell discovered near the basin, where they were kept in complete darkness, food passed through a slit in the cage, water from a plastic bottle. No talking, no questions, just rules written in silence. But then, something changed. Helen noticed that the man, she didn't know his name at the time, started using sound differently, leaving recordings outside the cell, low-pitched loops meant to confuse or distort, sometimes music, sometimes jungle sounds, other times her own voice, pulled from old phones, spliced and stretched until it became barely recognizable. She realized then this wasn't just captivity, it was conditioning. They weren't supposed to break in obvious ways. They were supposed to dissolve, become still, disoriented, passive. But she fought it. She tracked time with scraped stones, counted breaths between meals. She taught Maren how to identify real birds from recorded ones, how to tell when the air moved differently, when someone was standing just out of reach. When they were moved again, she paid attention. The ground changed, the leaves, the temperature, and the sound. The turning point came the day they heard it, faint at first. A child's voice in the trees, a recording, she thought. But then it repeated, louder, and Maren had jumped. "That's me," she said. "That's from my birthday." Helen realized the captor had made a mistake. The voice wasn't coming from a speaker. It was traveling, naturally, from outside, through terrain that carried sound further than it should. The same echo manipulation Hayes had used to disorient them had worked in reverse. Only this time, the source was real. It was David, calling into the jungle. After that, everything shifted. They began marking which direction sound carried loudest, which ridges bounced voices. They moved at night, listening, for patterns. Maren shouted until her throat blistered, hoping one scream might land in the right place. They slept in hollowed logs beneath thickets, ate fruit, drank from stagnant pools, risked parasites. Maren wrote messages on leaves with stones. Helen buried her own bloodied cloth as a marker when they left the last camp. And when they finally broke free, when Hayes chased and failed to track them, they didn't go straight. They went deep, made themselves disappear. Used every technique she'd learned by watching him. Echo paths, light breaks, low crawl movement. Helen said it wasn't escape. It was reversal. They'd become what he trained others to be. Now, safe and under protection, they were flown back to the United States in a private military transport, their faces hidden, their location undisclosed. The government denied knowledge of any unofficial contractor operating in Belize. Russell Hayes was labeled a rogue actor, a ghost, an aberration. But Helen, in her final recorded interview for the documentary, said otherwise. He trained people to break you without touching you, but he forgot we were already strong. She held Maren's hand as she said it, thin, quiet fingers wrapped around a girl who still wouldn't sleep unless she was touching her mother's side. The jungle had tried to take them, bend them, vanish them, but it hadn't. The screams David heard weren't echoes. They were signals, real and human. Maren had shouted because she believed someone was still out there listening, and someone was. In the end, the jungle didn't give them back. They found their own way out.